In a world where power often hides behind polished uniforms and courtroom walls, one woman dared to walk into the lion's den, not with an army, not with weapons, but with nothing more than the truth. Samantha Brooks, a highly decorated black FBI agent, stepped into that St. Louis courthouse with a purpose: to expose a web of lies so deeply rooted, it had poisoned justice itself. But within moments, she was stopped. Dismissed. Humiliated. Her badge ignored. Her authority stripped away. Her dignity challenged in front of a crowd that watched, paralyzed by fear. Cuffed like a criminal. Silenced like an enemy. What the officer who arrested her didn't know was that Samantha wasn't just another case to be buried. She was the storm he never saw coming. In just 7 minutes, the hunter would become the hunted. And the truth, raw, undeniable, and devastating, would crack open the entire system. Stay with us, because what you are about to witness isn't just a story. It's a reckoning. The heavy doors of the St. Louis courthouse creaked open as Samantha Brooks stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floors. She wore her authority like a second skin, a sleek black suit perfectly tailored to her athletic frame, a brown leather briefcase clutched tightly in her hand, and an FBI badge gleaming proudly on her chest. Her heart pounded steadily, not from fear, but from the weight of the day's mission. Today was not just another assignment. Today, she was carrying the truth that could rip through a fortress of corruption. But within seconds, that calm resolve was shattered. Officer Brent Halverson, a middle-aged cop with tired eyes and a sneer that spoke volumes, stepped directly into her path. His gaze raked over her with naked suspicion, ignoring the badge she presented without hesitation. "That's fake," he barked, his voice loud enough to draw attention from everyone in the corridor. Samantha barely had time to explain before his hand clamped down hard on her wrist, twisting her arm behind her back in a brutal, unnecessary show of force. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into her skin as the room around her froze. Lawyers, clerks, even the judge himself stood in stunned silence, their mouths agape, their hands motionless. For a split second, a searing wave of humiliation and rage crashed over Samantha. She could hear the clicks of cell phones capturing the moment, the indignity of it, the wrongness of it, preserved forever in digital memory. Yet she did not scream, did not beg. She clenched her jaw, drawing strength from every moment in her life when she had been underestimated, overlooked, disrespected, and survived. Her cheek pressed against the cold wooden railing, Samantha whispered under her breath, so low that only Halverson could hear. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." But he laughed, a dry, mocking sound, tightening the cuffs even further, utterly unaware that the woman he had just humiliated was not only an FBI agent but the lead investigator carrying explosive evidence that would, within minutes, dismantle everything he thought untouchable. The courthouse had fallen into a tense, breathless silence. But beneath that silence, a storm was gathering, and Samantha Brooks was its epicenter. As the door clicked shut behind her, Samantha Brooks sat alone in the stark detention room. The red marks from the handcuffs still burned across her wrists like a painful reminder of the injustice she had just suffered. The cold, sterile room felt suffocating, the air thick with unspoken tension. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the sharp sting of humiliation to fade, replaced by something far more powerful, a deep, unwavering resolve. She had faced far worse in her life, and she had learned long ago that humiliation was a fleeting thing. What mattered now was what came next. The door creaked open, and a young officer, his face tentative and unsure, entered. He held out a glass of water, his eyes avoiding hers, clearly uncomfortable. "Are you all right?" "You don't have to stay in here alone," he murmured, his voice soft, almost apologetic. Samantha glanced up, her eyes locking with his for a brief moment. She could see the pity in his gaze, the awkwardness in his posture. She didn't need sympathy. She didn't need kindness. She needed clarity, focus. And in that moment, she knew that no one would come to her rescue. No one could fix what had just happened. She was on her own. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the room like a razor. She leaned back in the chair, the coolness of the metal pressing against her spine. The weight of what had just happened, the public humiliation, the cuffs, the mockery, didn't break her. It made her stronger. She had known this moment might come. In fact, she'd been preparing for it her entire career. But it wasn't just the public display that stung. It was the truth that had become undeniable. In a flash, her credentials had meant nothing. She had been reduced to just another black woman in a room full of prejudices, assumptions, and biases. For a moment, she had been nothing more than a stereotype. Samantha's mind raced back to the contents of her briefcase, the evidence she had meticulously gathered over months of undercover work. The USB device it contained held everything. Everything that could bring down the corrupt officers who thought they were untouchable. Including Brent Halverson, the man who had just humiliated her in front of an entire courtroom. She had never been more determined to see justice done. Her fingers tingled with anticipation as she thought about the recordings, the testimonies, and the videos that were about to be shown to the world. The incriminating evidence that would expose Halverson's role in a network of corrupt cops. He thought he had won, thought he could silence her, put her in her place. He was wrong. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. And she wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. Samantha stood up slowly, her eyes narrowing with purpose. She picked up her briefcase, feeling its weight like a final reminder of her mission. As she walked out of the room, she knew there was no turning back. The stakes had just risen. She entered the courtroom again, but this time, everything had changed. The energy in the room was electric. The reporters, the lawyers, even the judge seemed to watch her with a new kind of intensity, a mix of curiosity and disbelief. But Samantha's focus remained laser-sharp. She didn't look at anyone else. She didn't need their validation. What she needed now was to be heard. She ascended to the witness stand, the murmurs of the crowd falling to a near silence as she took her seat. Samantha's gaze swept the room. Halverson sat across from her, his face flushed with anxiety, his hands jittery in his lap. She could see the sweat on his brow, the way his eyes darted nervously. His arrogance had vanished, replaced with the first signs of fear. As she reached into her briefcase and pulled out the USB device, the weight of it in her hand felt almost symbolic. She held the power now. She didn't just have evidence. She had the truth, and that truth was about to unravel everything. "Your Honor," Samantha began, her voice calm but unwavering. "For the past 7 months, I have been leading an undercover investigation into widespread corruption within the St. Louis Police Department. The evidence I am about to present clearly shows a pattern of illegal activity that has been ignored for far too long." With a practiced motion, she connected the USB device to the projector. The room fell silent as the screen flickered to life, and the unmistakable voice of Officer Halverson crackled through the speakers. She watched as his expression shifted, from smug defiance to unmistakable recognition of the trap she had set. The room was now fully aware of what was unfolding. Samantha didn't just have a story. She had proof. Proof that would shatter the trust placed in those who were sworn to protect and serve. And Halverson? He was no longer just a figure of authority in the courtroom. He was about to become the face of corruption. And no one, not even him, could stop it. The silence in the courtroom was palpable, as thick as the tension that hung in the air. Samantha stood at the front, her heart pounding with the weight of the moment. Her fingers, still trembling from the sheer adrenaline, moved the USB device into the projector. The courtroom was filled with eager anticipation, the eyes of every observer fixed on her. There was no going back now. Her voice, though steady, trembled slightly as she began to play the first of the recordings, her gaze never leaving Officer Halverson. The grainy audio echoed through the room, a voice laced with authority but now steeped in corruption. "I don't care what you have to do, just make sure the report's clean." Officer Halverson's voice was unmistakable. "We don't need any more problems, especially with those damn protesters. Do what needs to be done, and make sure we don't leave a trail." The words cut through the air like a knife, sharper with every syllable. Samantha's fingers tightened around the stand, grounding herself, keeping her mind focused on the task ahead. Her pulse raced in her ears as she watched Halverson's expression slowly shift from arrogant certainty to the unmistakable signs of panic. His face drained of color, his lips parting slightly as the weight of his own guilt began to sink in. He tried to shift uncomfortably in his seat, but there was nowhere for him to hide. The evidence was out in the open, and there was no escape. The room was still, the once buzzing atmosphere now frozen under the pressure of the damning evidence. The murmur of disbelief that rippled through the room was a faint undercurrent to the silence that followed. Samantha's eyes never wavered from Halverson, who had begun to squirm in his seat, the brashness and arrogance he had once worn like armor slipping away piece by piece. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrests of his chair, the facade crumbling before the eyes of everyone in the room. Samantha could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, each gaze heavy with expectation. She wasn't just exposing Halverson, she was bringing to light a deeply entrenched system of corruption that had gone unchecked for too long. The anger, frustration, and pain she had kept buried for months now surfaced in her steady, unwavering voice. "This is not an isolated incident. What you just heard is only one of many tapes, each one documenting the same pattern: racial profiling, evidence tampering, and blatant misconduct. The lies these officers have lived under for years are about to come crashing down." Her voice cut through the room, cutting away the remaining pretenses of justice. With each word, the walls that had once protected the corrupt began to crack. Her heart raced, but she steadied her breath, allowing the truth to carry her forward. She could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of her words sinking in with every passing second. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She wasn't just standing here because of the years of frustration or the humiliation she had endured that morning. She was speaking for every victim of racial injustice, every officer who had stood silently by, and every citizen whose voice had been silenced for far too long. As the first recording ended, she glanced at Halverson, whose eyes were darting around the courtroom. His self-assurance had vanished, replaced by the unmistakable scent of fear. He could no longer hide behind his badge, behind the years of authority he had accumulated. In that moment, he was no different than any other man exposed for his wrongdoings. He was vulnerable. And it showed. His once commanding presence had shrunk, his posture hunched as he glanced nervously at his lawyer, who was scribbling furiously, likely trying to find a way out of the trap that had been set for him. Samantha pressed on, her resolve hardening with every word. "I have 12 more recordings just like this one," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Each one connected to cases of unjust detention, falsified charges, and the manipulation of evidence. These are not the actions of a rogue officer. These are coordinated actions meant to protect a system built on racial profiling and abuse of power." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. She could feel the weight of the audience's gaze, the pressure building on every inch of her skin. But she didn't flinch. She had come too far to let fear stop her now. She was no longer just the woman they tried to humiliate that morning, she was the woman holding the truth in her hands, and she would not back down. The murmurs in the room grew louder as Samantha reached the peak of her testimony. She played another recording, this one showing Halverson's unmistakable voice, ordering an officer to fabricate charges against a young black man for a crime he did not commit. Samantha felt the air in the room grow thick with disbelief. The weight of the injustice was almost tangible, and in that moment, it was clear that the courtroom had shifted. The balance of power had swung in her favor, but she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As the prosecutor stood and asked Samantha to identify the officer who had humiliated her earlier, she didn't hesitate. "Officer Brent Halverson," she said firmly, her eyes never leaving the man who had caused her so much anguish. The room fell silent as the judge confirmed, the same officer involved in the morning's incident. Samantha could hear the nervous shuffling from Halverson's side, the realization that there was no way to escape the truth. But she wasn't finished yet. With calculated precision, she pulled out the second USB device, this one marked with bright red tape. The next chapter of the truth was about to unfold. "I filed an emergency motion this morning," she continued, her voice unwavering. "This motion includes the declassification of new evidence and a request for immediate disciplinary action against Officer Brent Halverson." Halverson's face contorted with panic as he realized what was coming. He stood up, his voice shaking as he protested, "This is a lie. It's a setup. You can't do this." His outburst was met with dead silence, the courtroom now fully aware of his fear. The courthouse was alive with energy, the hum of reporters and onlookers mingling with the echoes of gavel strikes. Yet, to Samantha, it felt as though the world had shifted into slow motion. The walls of the courtroom, once so imposing, now seemed distant, as if she were watching everything from a distance, detached from the chaos that surrounded her. Her breath was shallow, her heart still racing from the adrenaline of the confrontation. She had done it, she had exposed Officer Halverson for his corruption, but as she stepped away from the witness stand, she felt the weight of what came next. The flashing cameras outside the courtroom overwhelmed her senses. The reporters' voices, sharp and demanding, filled the air as they closed in on her, their microphones thrusting forward in her face. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the world pressing in on her from every angle. Her mind spun with 1,000 thoughts. What had she just unleashed? Had she truly won, or had she simply opened the door to something even darker? But beneath the surface of the questions swirling in her mind, one thought remained constant: the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the reporters swarmed her, Samantha stood still, her posture unwavering, though her fingers curled tightly around the strap of her briefcase. She had expected this, expected the attention, the questions, the bright lights, but even so, she wasn't ready for the raw intensity of it all. She had come to this moment with the singular purpose of exposing the truth, but now, in the aftermath, she found herself questioning the cost. A reporter's voice cut through the noise, demanding an answer. "Do you think Halverson's conviction will change anything in the system? Or is this just the first domino in a much larger corruption network?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Samantha paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. She could feel the eyes of every person in the crowd on her, waiting for her to speak, to provide a resolution. But the truth was, there was no simple answer. She had exposed one man, one officer, but the rot ran deep. Halverson was just a symptom of a much larger problem. Her voice, when it came, was steady, though it was edged with the exhaustion of the day. "This isn't about one officer. This is about a system that has been broken for too long. Halverson is just the tip of the iceberg. The real work begins now." Her words were sharp, cutting through the noise, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade into the background. A few heads nodded in agreement, but the murmur of dissent was louder. Someone questioned her, others scoffed at her resolve. Samantha didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that speaking the truth wasn't about winning the approval of others. It was about doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy. Dean, her lawyer and trusted ally, stepped in, gently pulling her away from the pressed throng. His presence was a calming anchor in the storm of questions and flashing cameras. "Let's get you out of here," he said, his voice low but filled with urgency. His protective instincts had kicked in the moment the press descended, and Samantha allowed herself to be led away without protest. As they walked toward the exit, she couldn't shake the feeling that something more was brewing beneath the surface. The fight was far from over, and the sense of victory she had felt moments ago was already starting to feel distant, replaced by the cold weight of what came next. The car ride back to her apartment was quiet. Dean, who had always known how to give her space when she needed it, remained silent, his gaze fixed out the window. Samantha leaned her head against the cool glass, letting the city pass by in a blur. Her mind was still racing. What would happen next? She had exposed the corruption within the police force, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Halverson was one man, but how many others like him were out there? How many had been protected, buried under layers of lies and manipulation? The message she had received earlier that day echoed in her mind. "You've only scratched the surface. Be careful, they are coming for you." Her pulse quickened at the thought. She had expected retaliation, but the words of the anonymous source made her feel like she was already on the edge of something bigger, something darker. They were watching her. And if they thought she could be silenced, they were gravely mistaken. She exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. They wanted to silence her. They wanted her to back down. But she couldn't. Not now. Not after everything she had sacrificed to get here. Back at her apartment, Samantha stepped inside and closed the door behind her, finally alone. The silence was a stark contrast to the chaos she had just left behind. She dropped her briefcase onto the table, her hands trembling slightly as she unzipped it, pulling out the second USB drive, the one that contained the additional evidence, the one that held the key to exposing the deeper levels of corruption. She didn't allow herself to sit down yet. She paced, her thoughts a tangled mess. What if she had pushed too far? What if she had awakened forces she couldn't control? The thought of everything escalating terrified her, but the fear was not enough to make her retreat. She had come too far to turn back now. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. Another encrypted message. She opened it without hesitation. "They'll come after you. But you're not alone. The truth will protect you." The words were a small comfort, but they did little to quiet the storm in her mind. Samantha knew what was at stake now. She knew that exposing the truth meant she would have to face the consequences head-on. She wasn't naive, she knew that the system would fight back. They would try to bury her, to break her, but she had already made up her mind. She would not stop. She could not stop. The phone buzzed again, but this time it was a call. The name on the screen was Dean. She answered it immediately, her voice steady but firm. "What is it?" "We need to move quickly," Dean said, his voice tense. "I've just received word. Halverson has connections. Powerful ones. He's not going down quietly. You need to be ready." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. It was worse than she thought. Halverson was only the beginning, and now she had to brace herself for the storm that was coming. "I'm ready," she said, her voice unwavering. "I've been ready for this." The battle had just begun. And she would see it through to the end, no matter what it took. The days following the incident in the courtroom were a blur of urgency and uncertainty. Samantha felt the relentless pull of the case wrapping itself tighter around her every waking moment. She had thought the worst was behind her, exposing Halverson, confronting corruption, but now, with the weight of what she had unleashed pressing heavily on her, the storm was only just beginning to gather force. Each day, the tension seemed to build, not just within the walls of her office, but in the air around her, as though the very city could sense the shift that had occurred. The small glances, the hushed whispers, the way people seemed to avoid eye contact, Samantha knew she was being watched, and it unsettled her. It wasn't just the case that was weighing on her, it was the fear that now clung to her like a second skin. The system she had always believed in was no longer a force for justice, but a looming shadow full of dangerous, unpredictable players. Everywhere she turned, she could feel it, eyes on her, every move scrutinized. The weight of knowing her every action was now being watched gnawed at her, but the thought of backing down, of walking away, was even more unbearable. That night, as Samantha sat in her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being suffocated by the quiet, by the stillness. The city outside was alive with its usual buzz, but to her, it felt distant, unreal. The hum of the streetlights seemed muffled as she stared at the piles of evidence, her mind running in circles, retracing every step she had taken. Could she have done more? Should she have done more? She shook her head, trying to push the self-doubt away. There was no time for hesitation now. She had already walked this far, there was no turning back. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from Dean. His name flickered across the screen, and despite the late hour, a jolt of anxiety shot through her chest. She couldn't remember the last time his messages had felt so urgent. Meet me. It's urgent. Her heart skipped a beat. The urgency in his tone was palpable, and a sense of foreboding crept in. The feeling of being watched intensified, and for a moment, she just stood there, staring at the screen. The room felt smaller, darker, as if the walls were closing in around her. She grabbed her coat quickly, barely sparing a glance in the mirror, her reflection only a shadow of the woman she once thought she was. She wasn't sure who she was becoming in this fight, but one thing was clear, this battle was far from over. The streets outside were colder than usual, the crisp air biting at her skin as she walked, her thoughts spinning wildly. Her steps quickened with each passing moment, the weight of Dean's message pressing on her chest like a heavy stone. As she moved through the quiet city, every noise seemed amplified, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of distant traffic, even her own breath. She tried to shake off the growing sense of dread, but it stuck to her like a shadow. Something was coming, and she didn't know if she was prepared for it. When she finally arrived at the cafe where Dean had asked her to meet, the soft glow of the overhead lights did little to ease her nerves. She spotted him right away, sitting at a small table by the window, his posture rigid, hands folded in front of him. His eyes were wide, scanning the room nervously before landing on her. The moment their gazes met, she could see the strain in his expression, the worry etched into every line of his face. Samantha approached cautiously, her steps deliberate as she slid into the seat across from him. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she waited for him to break the silence, for him to say something, anything, that would explain the sudden sense of urgency in his voice. He leaned forward, eyes flicking to the door one more time before he spoke in a low, almost strained voice. "Samantha, you need to be very careful right now," he began, his tone heavy with concern. "What you're dealing with, it's bigger than Halverson. It's more than just the corruption in the department. There's a whole network at play here. People with influence, power, and they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who gets in their way." Her stomach churned as his words sank in. She had known that Halverson was just the tip of the iceberg, but hearing Dean confirm her worst fears made her blood run cold. A network of corruption, deep and far-reaching. It made everything she had done feel like just the beginning, the first crack in a much larger system of lies and deceit. "Do you think they'll come after me?" Samantha asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though she already knew the answer. She had felt the shift in the air, the way people now treated her with a mix of suspicion and fear. It wasn't just about the case anymore, it was about her, her life, her safety. But she couldn't stop. She had already taken the first step, and turning back was not an option. Dean's face tightened, and for a moment, he didn't answer. His eyes searched hers, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, finally, he spoke again. "I've been digging into Halverson's connections. This goes deeper than you realize, Samantha. These people, they're not just in the police department. They're everywhere. And they're coming for you." Samantha's mind raced as she processed his words. There was no longer any question in her mind. They had already targeted her. And she had a choice to make: back down and let the corruption continue to fester, or stand her ground and expose the rot, no matter the cost. "I'm not backing down," she said, her voice firm, a steely resolve settling into her chest. "I've come too far. I've seen too much to stop now. If they want to silence me, they'll have to kill me first." Dean didn't flinch at her words, but his expression softened, a mixture of admiration and fear in his eyes. "You're braver than I give you credit for, Samantha. But don't underestimate them. They will come at you with everything they have." "I'm ready," she replied, though she knew deep down that no amount of preparation could truly prepare her for what was coming. She had made a promise to herself, and to the people she had sworn to protect, that she would not back down, no matter the cost. As she stood to leave, Dean reached out, a hand briefly touching her arm. "Just stay sharp, okay? Watch your back. Trust no one." Samantha nodded, the weight of his words settling deep in her bones. "I will." She stepped out of the cafe into the cold night, her breath visible in the air. The city around her seemed quieter now, more ominous. Every step she took felt heavier, the enormity of the battle ahead looming larger than ever. But as she walked through the streets, her resolve only hardened. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop. The storm was coming, but she was ready to face it head-on. And no matter what they threw at her, she would stand her ground. The fight for justice wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Samantha Brooks didn't just survive that day, she rewrote the rules. She stood where she was never meant to stand, spoke truths that were never meant to be heard, and shattered the illusion that a badge, a title, or a courtroom could silence what was right. In the aftermath, corrupt officers fell. Hidden crimes came to light. And across the nation, a fire was lit, one that could no longer be ignored. But Samantha's victory didn't come without scars. Every step forward cost her sleepless nights, whispered threats, and battles most would never see. She fought, not for applause, not for headlines, but for the simple, radical idea that justice belongs to everyone. Now, the question is no longer whether corruption exists. It's whether we have the courage to confront it. If you were in Samantha's place, would you have spoken out? Would you have risked everything to do what was right? Tell us in the comments, your voice matters more than you know. And remember, true justice isn't given. It's fought for. Subscribe now for more powerful true stories that prove even one voice can change everything.